General George S. Patton Jr. was not merely a warrior of fire and fury, he was a meticulous student of applied logistics. His brilliance lay not just in the speed of his tanks but in the organized chaos of their support structure. Patton understood that the advance of any army is constrained by the fuel, ammunition, and rations it can carry forward. He famously declared that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics, a quote that encapsulates his entire military philosophy. This commitment to the supply chain was the very bedrock of the Third Army's legendary rapid movement across France in 1944. He demanded constant, almost obsessive attention to the flow of material from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. To him, a halted tank was not a tactical failure but a logistical one, a breakdown in the mechanical rhythm of war. The Third Army's success was a testament to the Red Ball Express, a colossal effort to keep his spearhead supplied far beyond conventional limits. Patton's eyes were trained to see the true vulnerabilities of an opponent, and they rarely settled on mere battlefield deployments. He looked past the number of enemy divisions and saw the finite capacity of their transport and sustainment systems. This acute focus on the enemy's tail was what made him such a devastatingly effective commander on the Western Front. He inherently knew that an army starved of gasoline and shells becomes an army ripe for swift, decisive destruction. His strategic genius was rooted in the unglamorous, often overlooked details of how the war machine actually runs. Patton viewed the entire theater of operations as a gigantic logistics problem waiting for a swift, brutal solution. It was this perspective that allowed him to instantly diagnose the fatal structural weakness of the German resistance. The general understood that the entire German war effort was fundamentally reliant on an infrastructure that was rapidly crumbling. He possessed the clarity of vision to see the entire operational scope, from the tactical skirmish to the strategic breakdown of supply. His relentless pursuit of the enemy was only possible because his own logistical system was designed to match his audacious pace. Patton knew that the war would be won not by the biggest army, but by the one that could move and fight the longest without stopping. The German command, obsessed with grand tactical maneuvers, failed to grasp this fundamental reality of modern mechanized warfare. He recognized a simple, profound truth: a brilliant offensive is only as good as the road it travels upon. Patton's observation on the German supply situation was a logistical prophecy of their eventual, inevitable defeat. This quote serves as a lasting lesson in the critical, unyielding importance of the logistics train in any military campaign. The German supply system, especially following the successful Allied invasion of Normandy, was a logistical catastrophe in slow motion. Hitler's strategy often prioritized aggressive, high-risk operational plans with little regard for the practicalities of sustainment. The German Wehrmacht was still heavily reliant on horse-drawn transport for a substantial portion of its divisional supplies. This archaic dependence on animals in a modern mechanized conflict became a crippling and insurmountable weakness. While the Allied forces roared across France powered by thousands of gasoline trucks, German units often trudged on foot. Fuel shortages became an existential crisis for the panzer divisions, often stalling critical armored counterattacks. The oil fields that fed the German war machine were increasingly targeted and devastated by Allied strategic bombing campaigns. The synthetic fuel industry, which Hitler banked on, could not keep pace with the enormous consumption demands of the front. Allied air superiority, established early in the campaign, meant that any large, visible German supply movement was a death sentence. Rail lines, the lifeblood of German logistics, were systematically cut, bombed, and destroyed by Allied fighter bombers and resistance fighters. Bridges became specific, high-priority targets, forcing German engineers into a constant, desperate race to repair and rebuild under fire. The sheer volume of material needed to supply millions of troops and thousands of vehicles on two major fronts was unsustainable. Patton's rapid breakthroughs, particularly the sweep through Brittany and the advance toward the Moselle River, further exposed these vulnerabilities. The speed of the Third Army often forced German units into a chaotic, uncoordinated retreat, abandoning precious fuel and equipment. Captured supply dumps revealed a desperate, patchwork system, full of mismatched and obsolescent foreign equipment. There was no unified, efficient system like the Red Ball Express to ensure a constant, predictable flow of essentials to the front. The German High Command repeatedly underestimated the logistical weight of modern armored warfare on a continental scale. This failure was a systemic issue, born of years of prioritizing offensive military doctrine over boring, persistent logistical planning. Patton's eye immediately grasped the magnitude of this organizational and infrastructural failing as he pushed deeper into enemy territory. He understood that the great German strategic thrusts were hollow, lacking the necessary physical means to sustain their momentum. The general's analysis transcended the immediate tactical picture and focused on the enemy's deepest, most incurable wound. He saw the German army not as a formidable fighting force, but as an enormous, starving beast slowly consuming itself. The vulnerability of the enemy's logistical tail was, to Patton, the ultimate military opportunity waiting to be exploited. Patton's famous remark about the German supply situation stemmed from a profound understanding of military history and human nature. He knew that the physical ability to fight is a direct function of the material resources available to the combatants. When the general advanced into territory recently held by the retreating German forces, the evidence of their decay was impossible to ignore. He observed the vast quantity of abandoned equipment, often still serviceable but immobilized by a lack of fuel or maintenance parts. It was a striking visual confirmation of a logistical breakdown, not a defeat in pure combat effectiveness. Patton saw valuable tanks and trucks simply discarded by the roadside because the supply chain could no longer reach them. The presence of numerous dead horses and broken-down wagons signaled a disastrous, medieval reliance in a mechanized war. He saw the desperation in the haphazard, often pilfered stockpiles of food and ammunition that were left behind in the chaotic retreats. Patton's observation was that the German army was not being beaten primarily by superior German strategy or courage. Instead, they were being fundamentally dismantled from within by their inability to feed, fuel, and repair their enormous frontline forces. The quote, often cited with a profane directness typical of Patton, focused on the sheer absurdity of their predicament. He recognized that the German soldier was fighting bravely, but their entire operational structure was a house of cards. The American ability to continuously pump fuel and ammunition forward, even at great strain, was the decisive differentiator. Patton's genius was in recognizing this logistical gulf as the enemy's single most critical point of failure. He understood that every mile his Third Army advanced increased the strain on the German logistical network exponentially. The faster he moved, the more fragile the enemy's system became, leading to a self-perpetuating cycle of collapse. He grasped the psychological effect on the German troops who constantly worried about their next meal or the last drop of gas for their vehicle. A soldier's morale is inextricably linked to the reliable arrival of his mail, his rations, and his necessary war supplies. The failure of German logistics translated directly into a catastrophic collapse of combat morale and unit cohesion. Patton's observation was not a boast but a cold, clinical assessment of the strategic landscape he was traversing. He understood that he was facing an army whose fighting heart was sound but whose vital arteries had been severed. This realization gave him the confidence to press his advantage relentlessly, knowing the enemy could not sustain a prolonged defense. He knew that the battle was being won not just in the field, but in the dreary, difficult world of ports, depots, and transport columns. The term blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, was intrinsically linked to an aggressive and unprecedented consumption of petroleum. Hitler's early victories in Poland and France masked a long-term strategic weakness in Germany's access to vital oil reserves. The initial rapid advances were fueled by pre-war stockpiles and the swift seizure of oil fields and refineries in conquered territories. However, once the war expanded to a global scale, the fundamental scarcity of natural oil within the Reich became a crippling factor. The Wehrmacht's reliance on their domestic synthetic fuel program, while innovative, proved to be strategically insufficient. Synthetic fuel production could never meet the astronomical demands of a massive, multi-front war fought with tanks and aircraft. Patton, whose entire doctrine was based on speed and the mechanized offensive, recognized this fuel dependency as the ultimate Achilles heel. He saw the German armored thrusts as inherently brittle, always a few days and a few thousand gallons of gasoline away from complete immobility. The German panzer divisions, the very symbol of their military might, became hostages to the logistical breakdown behind them. When Patton's Third Army was advancing, his constant and often controversial demands for fuel were a reflection of his priorities. He knew that a full tank of gas was more valuable than an extra company of infantry in a rapid breakthrough scenario. His logistics officers performed miracles to sustain his advance, creating the continuous, dedicated flow of the Red Ball Express. This dedicated transport system ensured that his armored divisions rarely stalled for lack of the necessary petroleum products. Patton could compare his overflowing fuel dumps and robust supply lines to the desperate, scavenging tactics of the retreating Germans. He understood that the failure of the German blitzkrieg was not a failure of tanks, but a failure of the fuel to run them. The German army was forced to conserve fuel for offensive operations, which critically limited their ability to train and maneuver defensively. This self-imposed strategic limitation made their forces more predictable and significantly easier for the Allies to target and destroy. The general's quote was a profound acknowledgement of the energy imbalance that was ultimately deciding the entire European conflict. He saw the irony in an army that invented a lightning war being brought to a grinding, slow halt by an empty fuel gauge. Patton's observation was the simple, brutal equation of modern conflict: no gas, no movement, no war-fighting capacity whatsoever. The vast majority of the German motor pool stood idle, not because they were destroyed in battle, but because they had no means of propulsion. The logistical disparity between the Allied and German armies was perhaps most starkly visible in their primary modes of transport. The United States Army was the most mechanized force in world history at that time, powered almost entirely by combustion engines. The famed American deuce-and-a-half truck, a massive workhorse, became the single most important tool in winning the European war. These sturdy, reliable vehicles could haul tons of supplies over enormous distances in a relatively short amount of time. In contrast, the German army entered the later stages of the war with over 500,000 horses actively deployed for transport duties. This dependence was a historical anachronism, a holdover from past wars that simply could not sustain the pace of 1944. Horses require feed, water, rest, and care, adding a complex layer of biological logistics to an already strained system. They are slow, vulnerable to air attack, and physically unable to keep pace with the swift, sustained advances of motorized divisions. Patton, the champion of the tank, viewed this German reliance on horsepower as an almost unbelievable, fatal weakness. He saw columns of horse-drawn carts struggling through the mud and over broken terrain while his own supplied trucks surged forward. This contrast highlighted the fundamental strategic mistake of the German High Command in their modernization efforts. They had prioritized the development of powerful tanks and aircraft but neglected the essential, unglamorous motor pool required to support them. The general understood that the war's ultimate victor would be determined by the army with the greatest wheeled lift capacity. Every single logistical decision the Germans made was constrained by the limits of animal-drawn transport and insufficient gasoline. Patton's entire command structure was built around the principle of uninterrupted motion and rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. His army could cover distances in a single day that would take a horse-drawn German unit a week to traverse. The German army's retreat often resulted in the horrific spectacle of abandoned, dying horses, a sign of their systemic collapse. These animals could not be sacrificed, but their slowing effect on the supply chain was a strategic nightmare for the commanders. Patton's comment on the German supply situation was a damning indictment of this logistical disconnect in the modern era. He recognized that the horse symbolized the outdated, under-resourced logistical tail that strangled the powerful German head. The sheer speed of the American logistical system allowed for an operational tempo that the Germans simply could not match or withstand. Patton grasped the immense strategic advantage afforded by an army that did not have to stop to feed or water its primary transport. The exact moment Patton spoke his famous, often quoted observation was likely a flash of profound military clarity amid the chaos of battle. It was not a long, philosophical treatise but a sharp, cutting remark made to a member of his staff or another high-ranking officer. This realization would have occurred upon inspecting a captured German storage depot or observing the aftermath of a hurried German retreat. A German depot was often a scene of desperate improvisation, full of mismatched uniforms, mixed-caliber ammunition, and insufficient fuel. Patton's military intuition allowed him to immediately calculate the strategic implications of this systemic disorder. He did not need complex intelligence reports to understand the German army's breaking point. He could see it in the physical evidence. The sight of a supply dump that was woefully inadequate for the scale of the fight would have been a glaring red flag to the general. He would have understood that this lack of material depth meant that every German tactical success was entirely fleeting and unsustainable. The German soldier, forced to hoard resources and scrounge for basic necessities, was fighting a losing battle against his own system. Patton, standing amid the wreckage of their failed logistics, recognized the true source of their vulnerability, their fatal weakness. The quote was an expression of disdain, not for the German soldiers' courage, but for the fundamental organizational failures of their command. He saw the German supply system as an operational joke, an amateurish attempt to sustain a modern army on a continental front. This moment of recognition gave Patton the final confirmation he needed to push his troops even harder and faster. He knew that the German defense would eventually run out of fuel, run out of shells, and simply cease to be a coherent fighting force. The supply situation was a silent, invisible killer that was doing more damage to the German war effort than any single Allied division. Patton's genius lay in his ability to read the battlefield's silent language of discarded equipment and starved transport networks. He was looking beyond the frontline skirmishes and assessing the long-term viability of the entire German operational structure. The quote was a moment of supreme strategic insight, a clear articulation of the logistical endgame that was rapidly unfolding. He understood that the ultimate outcome of the war was already determined by the differential in industrial and logistical capacity. This clear-sightedness made him an almost prophetic figure, correctly predicting the manner in which the German defense would finally crumble. The specific, unvarnished quote Patton delivered about the German supply situation is a powerful statement of military realism. While the precise wording varies due to the nature of battlefield accounts, the meaning is universally consistent. It conveys a blunt realization that the German army was strategically bankrupt, their grand strategy undermined by mundane failures. Patton's assessment was a form of professional contempt for an army that prioritized show and offensive thrusts over sound sustainment. The quote essentially meant that the Germans had squandered their limited resources and were fighting on fumes and prayer alone. It was an observation that elevated the importance of the logistics officer to the same level as the combat commander. Patton's remark highlighted the fatal difference between a powerful, but brittle, military machine and a robust, sustainable one. The American ability to mass supplies, even under extreme pressure, was the ultimate expression of the nation's industrial might. The German inability to protect or sustain their supply lines was a strategic failure that industrial might could not easily mend. Patton was not focused on the bravery of the German soldier, which he often respected, but on the ineptitude of their logistical planning. He saw the German army as fundamentally paralyzed, trapped by the operational limits imposed by an empty fuel drum and a broken truck. The quote served as a constant, implicit order to his own command: never, ever let this happen to the Third Army. He was acutely aware that his own aggressive advances constantly flirted with logistical disaster, but he planned meticulously against it. Patton's remark became an internal rallying cry, a simplified truth that guided the relentless pace of his armored columns. It underscored the belief that if you can move faster and resupply more efficiently, you can overcome almost any battlefield obstacle. The quote is a timeless lesson that strategy without a corresponding logistical plan is nothing more than wishful, doomed thinking. It articulated the fact that the German defeat was preordained the moment their supply lines became fundamentally unstable. Patton was a master of psychological warfare, and this quote likely bolstered the confidence of his own men in their superior capacity. He made it clear that the enemy they were facing was powerful, but fundamentally and mortally wounded by logistics. The full weight of the observation revealed that the American army did not just defeat the Germans, it outsupplied them completely. The German supply situation was tragically compounded by the strategic blunder of simultaneous overextension on multiple fronts. Hitler's insistence on holding every scrap of territory led to a defense that was too thin and too widely dispersed to be effectively supplied. The massive commitment of forces to the Eastern Front continually drained resources, personnel, and material from the Western theater. Every German supply truck, every gallon of fuel, and every able-bodied mechanic was subject to a desperate tug-of-war between the two fronts. Patton was operating in a theater where the Germans could never fully concentrate their logistical efforts, to his immense advantage. He correctly analyzed that the German army lacked the necessary reserve capacity to shift supplies quickly to meet his aggressive breakthroughs. The speed of the Third Army's advance constantly caught the German logistics system flat-footed, unable to react to the shifting front lines. Patton's movements created deep pockets of confusion and logistical chaos behind the retreating German divisions. Supply depots that were meant to sustain a forward advance suddenly became vulnerable rear-area targets for Allied raids and reconnaissance. The sheer distance from the German homeland to the forward operating units in France became an insurmountable transportation hurdle. Patton understood that every mile he gained represented a disproportionate logistical strain on the already faltering enemy. The German commanders were forced to make impossible choices, sacrificing one sector's supplies to briefly sustain another. This constant, desperate prioritization created a systemic vulnerability that Patton's tank divisions expertly exploited every single day. He saw the German operational picture as a rope stretched so thin that a single sharp pull could snap the entire line. The quote regarding the German supply problem was a direct acknowledgement of this fundamental strategic overreach by the Wehrmacht. It was not just a comment on the number of trucks they possessed, but on the impossibility of their overarching military goals. Patton knew that the war was a contest of endurance, and the German army had long since exhausted its reserves of time and material. The logistical crisis was the physical manifestation of Hitler's delusion that a single nation could sustain a fight against the world's industrial powers. The strategic overextension meant that any minor failure in the supply chain rapidly cascaded into an operational disaster for the German forces. The famous Battle of the Bulge, launched in the brutal winter of 1944, was the ultimate, desperate gamble driven by a logistical crisis. The entire German Ardennes offensive was predicated on the immediate capture of vast Allied fuel dumps, particularly around Antwerp. Hitler knew his own forces did not have the necessary gasoline to sustain the long, ambitious push to the sea. The plan was a forced concession to the reality of their empty fuel tanks, a strategic move based on immediate logistical necessity. Patton's rapid, 90-degree turn of the Third Army to relieve Bastogne was a masterclass in logistical flexibility and speed. This audacious maneuver was only possible because his own supply lines, though strained, held together under immense pressure. The sight of the German spearhead stalled and frozen in the Ardennes, abandoned for lack of fuel, confirmed Patton's earlier observation. Their tanks, the pride of the German army, became mere steel monuments to a logistical failure, sitting targets for Allied aircraft. The logistical failure in the Bulge was not a single point of collapse but the culmination of months of systemic German decay. Patton saw that the German High Command had bet the entire Western Front on a supply situation that was already catastrophically compromised. The German supply units could not keep up with the initial rush, and the Allied forces successfully protected their vital fuel depots. When Patton arrived at the scene of the stalled offensive, the evidence of German logistical impotence was overwhelmingly clear. He saw the difference between an army that was organized to fight a sustained war and one that could only manage a fleeting thrust. The quote, "even months later," served as a perfect explanation for why the Bulge, for all its initial shock, was destined to fail. The offensive was an attempt to ignore the logistical reality, a reckless throw of the dice that ultimately cost the Wehrmacht its remaining strength. Patton's understanding of the supply chain allowed him to predict the enemy's inevitable deceleration and collapse into immobility. He was not surprised by the failure of the German counteroffensive, only by the audacity of their planning under such constraints. The image of the frozen, unmoving German tanks in the snow is the iconic visual representation of Patton's logistical prophecy fulfilled. It underscores the harsh lesson that no amount of fighting spirit can overcome the cold, hard mathematics of military supply. Allied air superiority acted as the relentless, unceasing hammer that ensured the German logistical system could never recover. From the moment the Allies secured dominance of the skies, every German supply movement became an open, vulnerable target. The fighter bombers of the 9th and 19th Air Forces specifically hunted trains, trucks, and all forms of rolling stock across France. The German rail network, their essential supply artery, was systematically choked off and reduced to a broken, useless skeleton. Patton's operations benefited immensely from this aerial interdiction, which did the difficult work of isolating the battlefield for him. He was free to concentrate on the rapid operational advance, knowing the enemy behind him was constantly being starved by air attack. The German ground forces were forced to disperse their supplies and travel only at night, drastically slowing the pace of all operations. This constant threat from the air had a devastating, demoralizing effect on the German logistical personnel and transport crews. Patton understood that the Allied strategic bombers were not just destroying factories, they were dismantling the enemy's capacity to move. The destruction of bridges, marshalling yards, and major depots created a permanent and irreparable blockage in the supply flow. The quote about the German supply situation was an implicit nod to the decisive, unquantifiable role of Allied air power in their defeat. He saw the Germans fighting a two-front war, one against the Allied ground forces and another against the relentless aerial assault. The vulnerability of the horse-drawn transport was most acute under the open scrutiny of Allied reconnaissance and attack aircraft. Patton's advance was often made easier by the destruction already wrought by the air forces on the German rear areas. He understood that air superiority was the ultimate logistical weapon, making the enemy's sustainment efforts a sheer impossibility. The Allied dominance in the air meant that any German attempt to reconstitute a robust supply line was immediately and violently crushed. This aerial superiority was an industrial and technological advantage that the Germans had no means of overcoming at this stage of the war. Patton knew that the combination of his speed on the ground and the air force's destruction from above created an inescapable logistical trap. The final defeat of the German army was less of a singular event and more of a protracted, inevitable logistical exhaustion. Patton's observation in the field perfectly summarized the process by which a great military machine simply ran out of breath. The scarcity of basic supplies translated directly into a loss of operational freedom and a rapid decline in combat effectiveness. German units became less aggressive, less mobile, and increasingly confined to static, often untenable defensive positions. The soldiers were often hungry, poorly equipped for the harsh European weather, and knew that replacements were unlikely to arrive. The constant worry over fuel and ammunition forced German commanders to abandon critical counterattacks before they even began. Patton watched as the once formidable German divisions began to disintegrate into small, poorly provisioned pockets of resistance. The process of surrender was often hastened not by overwhelming combat, but by the simple, brutal reality of an empty stomach and an empty magazine. The quote serves as a powerful historical reminder that the logistical tail of the army is ultimately more important than its fighting teeth. The Third Army's breakthroughs were possible because they could sustain a higher operational tempo than the Germans could withstand. Patton recognized that the German army was a house built on sand, their tactical successes unable to compensate for structural weakness. The end of the war was an act of administrative and logistical finality as much as it was a military victory in the field. The sight of mass surrenders, with troops looking physically defeated and exhausted, was the final confirmation of Patton's insight. He understood that logistics dictate strategy, and the German lack of supply had ultimately dictated their complete and utter loss. The abandoned tanks, the discarded equipment, and the vast numbers of captured prisoners all testify to this fundamental truth. Patton's enduring lesson is that the path to victory is paved with the steady, unglamorous flow of gasoline, beans, and bullets. General Patton's candid observation on the German supply situation remains one of the most powerful and insightful military quotes of the 20th century. It has transcended its original context and is now taught in military academies worldwide as a foundational principle of warfare. The phrase has become a universal management principle, illustrating that grand vision is useless without meticulous execution and support. Patton's focus on the logistical underpinnings of victory continues to influence modern military planning and resource allocation strategies. His relentless insistence on efficiency and speed in the supply chain remains a benchmark for all contemporary combat commanders. The story of the Third Army is not just a tale of armored dash but a testament to the organizational brilliance behind the fighting forces. Patton's legacy is a clear, unambiguous statement that the unglamorous work of the Supply Corps is what ultimately wins the world's great conflicts. He taught the world that the enemy's gravest wound is often a self-inflicted logistical failure, hidden behind a facade of strength. The quote is a timeless warning against the hubris of military planning that fails to account for the harsh realities of sustainment. Patton's genius was his holistic view of the battlefield, seeing the war as a single, interconnected system of supply and demand. The failure of the German supply system serves as a perpetual case study in the catastrophic results of logistical neglect in a major war. Patton, the glamorous tank commander, was at his core an intensely practical man who understood the language of tonnage and kilometers. His blunt assessment of the German situation cut through all the battlefield noise and got straight to the decisive strategic point. The lasting lesson from Patton is that a professional soldier understands that the movement of material is the true choreography of battle. This single, powerful quote encapsulates the entire strategic difference between the Allied victory and the German defeat in the West. The enduring image of Patton is the man who saw the end of the war not in a final battle, but in an empty German fuel tank.